Some people call the coronavirus the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus, including the President of the United States. And today, I would like to explain why other people find those terms horrific, because I haven't actually seen anyone go through and explain and justify why people get offended at these terms. I have seen that for some people who do stick to those terms, people on the right, they don't really see the problem. In fact, they think that anyone who does have a problem with those terms is being ridiculous and illogical. Now, I tend to want to take people's views seriously, so it's a problem if some people think it's so self-evidently fine that people should not object to it at all. And other people think it's so self-evidently not fine as to be completely unworthy of even discussing. We have a huge gap in people's interpretation of whether it's all right to call something the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus. Now, the president defended his decision to do it by saying that's where it comes from. That's where the virus comes from. And he's backed off his use of it a little bit recently out of mostly the diplomatic need to not piss off the giant nation of China with 1.3 billion people in it. However, I have a sense that deep down inside, he's upset that he had to back off it and he would keep using it if he could, and he even crossed out coronavirus in his briefing notes and wrote Chinese virus. The people who use these terms, and they are mostly conservatives, their argument is this: it's from China, so you call it a Chinese virus. What's the problem? And the response that people who don't like that term give is, why would you associate the virus with China? And then it just goes back and forth with them repeating the same things back and forth to each other, where the people who hate it go, well, viruses don't have a country, you're associating a virus with Chinese people aren't a virus. And then the people who like the term going, yeah, but it came from there, there's nothing inaccurate. The association was done by the fact that the virus arose there. There's nothing that I'm contributing. I'm not deliberately trying to say that Chinese people are like a virus. I'm just making the factually accurate point that the virus originated in a particular place. So who's right here? Well, I think that the people who use the term are not really thinking about what the objection is. Because what they usually say is something like, well, we have other diseases that are named after their places, like the Spanish flu, and the German measles, and Ebola. Ebola is named after a river, the Ebola River. And in fact, Bill Maher recently defended the use of the term Chinese virus, and that's precisely what he said. He said scientists have been naming diseases after the places they came from for a very long time. There's the West Nile virus, and Rocky Mountain spotted fever, MERS, which is Middle East respiratory syndrome. And he said, so why is everyone so mad about the China virus? First off, I mean, just as a tiny point, it's often inaccurate, right? The Spanish flu wasn't actually from Spain. But also, even when it is accurate, I think that even if we've done it before, a case like this in which you have a really large global pandemic, right? So one thing is that it might not have been a problem in part because it wasn't something of the kind of scale. I mean, Bill Maher mentions Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Well, Rocky Mountain spotted fever is a big problem, but coronavirus is everywhere. So everyone's dealing with this at one time, and I think it's important to think about what the consequences of applying the name Chinese to the actual virus are. What does it do when we add that term? Because names are a choice, right? We could call it the coronavirus, we could call it the COVID-19, we could call it the Chinese virus. But the question is, what are you trying to do by picking a particular name for it? What does that information add? And I think one thing about calling it the Wuhan virus or the Chinese virus is it doesn't really add much information that we already know. The National Review had an article where they said, well, it's not racist to point out that the virus originated in Wuhan, China. And that's true. But the question here is not, can you point out that the virus originated there, but should you incorporate the point of origination into the colloquial name of the virus? And I'm not sure that it really adds anything to know this, but it does subtract something. That is to say, it adds a stigma against Chinese people. And you can say, no, it doesn't. I'm not intending any stigma against Chinese people. I love Chinese people, because that's what conservatives always do. They kind of, I don't want to say they play dumb, because I don't know if they're playing, but they do kind of say, well, I have no idea what you're talking about when you say stigma. But I mean, there are anecdotal reports of Asian Americans who have been told during this pandemic, they're like, why did you people bring us this virus? And that's really gross and disgusting. And like, if you think about what it's like to be a Chinese person and then to have like the Chinese virus everywhere, people are going to think that you have a virus. Again, you might say, well, people who think that are dumb. Well, maybe. But it's still going to happen, right? It's still going to happen when you create associations in people's heads. Now, I think we know that subconscious associations are a thing, right? That's corporate branding is all sort of built on subconscious associations. If we say this word next to this thing, it'll make people think of the two together, and then they'll sort of swirl around their brain. And we don't really know how well it works often, but I think we do know that there's a risk that by calling something the Chinese virus, they will associate it with Chinese people, all Chinese people. Did you really get anything out of doing this? Well, no, but out of picking that name, but you do lose something, which is that you make the virus and Chinese people tied together in the popular discourse. And that, to me, like, when I heard this term the first time, I didn't think to myself, that's racist. I thought, that's kind of gross. This is kind of gross. It just made me really uncomfortable thinking about that. It really seemed just unpleasant to me. So it's like, well, why wouldn't you just not do that then, when we have a perfectly scientific name, which is coronavirus? So why are you so insistent? Why are you so proud? Why do you want to call it the Chinese virus? Oh, because it's from there. It's from there. I said it's from there. Yeah, but so what? What does the fact that it's from there mean? The question is, why are you picking out this particular quality of the virus, the fact that it originated in one country, and using that as part of what you want to say over and over and over and over and over again? And I suspect, even though they probably deny it, that it has something to do with wanting to blame China for the virus, because it often comes along with people saying, well, China hid the virus, China this, China that. And one of the dangers of that is that when we talk about we use the word, colloquially, we use the word China or the word in the United States to refer to both the people and their government. But those are two very, very different things, right? There's 300 million people in the United States, and the United States government is a particular set of institutions. But when we say the United States, we mean both of those things. So what happens is we want to blame the Chinese government, which is a set of institutions, but then we end up associating things with just the people, ordinary people, so that every person ends up seemingly being responsible for the actions of a government that they may have had nothing to do with, perhaps in a region of the country they've never even set foot in. So that seems very, very unfair. This reminds me of the way that conservatives kind of pretend that they don't know what you're talking about when you say that, for example, white people using the N-word is worse than black people using the word honky. And oftentimes conservatives are like, well, no, racism, it's just like, it's the same. Why is anti-white racism not as bad as anti-black racism? Why isn't Malcolm X as bad as David Duke? And they've been saying this for a long time. And what they do is they kind of ignore the fact that we live in a world, we live in a context. We live in a place that has had a history. And history, I don't mean that in a very abstract sense. What I mean is that anti-black racism has evolved in the context of a racial hierarchy in this country. First, black people being literally in chains for hundreds of years, but even now having just so much less wealth, so much more incarceration, so much less access to power and status, and that anti-black racism, those terms, were used as part of maintaining that racial hierarchy, even after slavery, right? Jim Crow, making sure that people never had their rights, making sure that people stayed at the bottom and the underclass class of society. And so it really isn't the same because it doesn't come out of the same, it doesn't serve the same purposes. The reason I bring up that comparison is Representative Ted Lieu, who's Asian American, when he was asked about the use of Wuhan or China virus, he said, well, it would be just as silly to call it like the Milan virus, Milan, Italy, if it came from Milan. And I actually think that Ted Lieu is being a little misleading there, because I think one of the things is that it is a little different to call it the Chinese virus than it would be to call it the German measles or the Spanish flu. Because in the United States, we have a long history of like the yellow peril stuff, right? And there is a lot of anti-Asian bigotry. There's popular racism against Chinese people as being sort of mysterious and other and threatening. And so when you make a kind of association with a disease against a people that are not typically seen as a threat, such as like the British, America associated, if it was called British measles, it wouldn't have the same function. It wouldn't create the same kinds of stigma. It wouldn't carry the same kinds of risks. There was a time in the United States when I think that anti-Italian bigotry was so strong that you wouldn't want to call it something the Italy virus, because it would risk associating things with the kind of stereotypes of Italians as being threatening and criminal and unclean and what have you. But now we're not really in that age, so it wouldn't actually be as bad. And so I think it is important to draw a distinction where it does matter that it is China. It isn't the same in every case. So there's often this if there's a logical parallel, the two things are the same. But history and culture and context and the society in which you actually live and the function that particular words have in particular kinds of relationships actually make a difference. So just as in the racism case, where it's like anti-white racism is generally pretty harmless in this country. I'm sorry, but it is. It's generally pretty harmless. There's never been like a violent order of a racial hierarchy in which white people are kept at the bottom by force and by terror in the way that there has the other way around, right? The wealth gap only runs in one direction. And so that's why I don't feel very threatened by anti-white racism. It feels so toothless. It feels like it can't wound. I think white privilege is a very real thing. I mean, the word privilege has sort of become a cringy kind of thing. You're privileged. But frankly, I got a lot of it. I could just tell in my life that people take me more seriously because of white, and it just happens. I'm sorry, it happens. It's real. So don't use the word Chinese virus. Wuhan virus, well, it's a little less bad than Chinese virus, but it's still pretty. It sounds kind of. It's just icky. Like maybe we should get away from these terms, these geographic terms altogether. Right? Bill Maher points out that other diseases have had the geographic terms applied, but maybe this is an opportunity to stop, right? Ebola, this is an interesting fact about Ebola. Ebola was named after the Ebola River, but the virus was not discovered at the Ebola River. The virus was discovered 60 miles from the river at a village called Yambuku. The professor who discovered the virus didn't want to call it the Yambuku virus because he didn't want to attach a stigma to Yambuku so that everyone from Yambuku would be associated with the virus the same way if you said, I'm from Ebola, people would associate you with the virus now. So he named it after a river, which made a lot of sense. It was kind of sensitive. But now the Ebola River's ruined. Maybe you should have just called it something that related to the actual virus itself rather than something about Africa. So maybe we shouldn't have West Nile virus, because West Nile virus, kind of, when I think West Nile virus, now I associate the West Nile with all these sort of mosquitoes and gross things. And that's quite bad, especially when people already have all these prejudices and preconceptions. Why would we reinforce them? Let's not reinforce them. Let's just find neutral names for viruses that don't, make pernicious stereotypes worse. How about that? Don't say Chinese virus. Jesus Christ. Just coronavirus. It's coronavirus. It's very easy. The president gave it up. You should too. I can't believe it. Why is Bill Maher, why is he coming out and saying this now? He's an asshole. This is really... Bill Maher, you're an asshole.